that if you watch enough gladiator movies, you can be trained without even knowing it to target one of the 7 lethal strike zones of the body. So on the weekend, as you know, we had another shooting stabbing episode in California, University campus in Santa Barbara. The perpetrator was a 22-year-old student with a history of mental illness, including Asperger's, although evidently there were still guns in the home, legally owned by him. And of course it was reported that his father was the associate director of the blockbuster teen film The Hunger Games, and a sequel to it as well. I don't know if there's a connection, but it does seem odd that this was the case. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Hunger Games. If you've got children, teenage children, you certainly will be. It's about kids killing kids, basically, and there's lots of websites on the internet that are associated with it. Now, the lure of the internet has created some perilous places for young people in particular. One is only to examine the missing discourse in the search for solutions on cyberbullying. Now, the discussion focuses exclusively on the need for exemplary behavior on the part of parents, teachers, and students. Absent is any recognition or acknowledgement of the impact of role models which glorify violence, power differentials, and abuse of women and children in popular culture. To a remarkable degree, pornography has become mainstream. We now have a scenario where public debate revolves around whether or not minors sexting, I think it's called, each other can or should be charged with making and distributing pornography on their iPhones. Meanwhile, our federal regulator, CRTC, has recently reprimanded 3 Toronto-based erotica TV channels for failing to broadcast sufficient levels of Canadian content. In other words, not enough Canadian pornography. Leave it to your discretion to decide whether this is an appropriate role for the CRTC. Now, exploiting children for profit is big business worldwide. Celebrants enthuse about how digital technology is revolutionizing education through gamification. But the role of teachers in classes such as physical education, art, and music are increasingly being marginalized. As pointed out at the Education and Technology Conference in Toronto in February of last year, programs that require students to bring their own digital devices to the classroom pose not only great rewards, but also great risks. Indeed, it was reported last year as well in the Toronto Star that Facebook addiction disorders, among them anxiety, depression, attention deficit disorder, and narcissism, are now accepted diagnoses in the mental health professions. It's also, last week on CBC radio, television, all the newspapers, mainstream Toronto papers anyway, seem to have a report on how a recent study that indicates that 90% of kids over 5 years of age are not meeting a target of 1 hour of exercise per day. Overall, in terms of physical activity, Canada gets a D-. Now, it was, and behind Mozambique and Mexico, their children are healthier when it comes to physical education. And of course, 66% of Canadian parents say that too much television, computer time is a part of the problem. The recommended solutions, at least in the Globe and Mail that had a big spread on it, was that we have to ensure that there are more school crossing guards and intersections in the city that will encourage parents not to drive the kids to school, but to let them walk to school. And caution to teachers that they should re-examine some of the safety policies in their playgrounds. But it's still nothing about those that are marketing digital devices to children and hoping they'll get hooked. Now, No, Canada is, according to the Toronto Star, one of the leading producers in violent video games. Eruptions of violence, serial murder, and senseless deaths continue to dominate news coverage. But as UBC law professor Joe Bacon points out in his book, Childhood Under Siege, by tapping into teen emotions of love and fear, addictinggames.com has become one of the internet's premier casual gaming sites. And every month, over 10 million players log on to play games such as Whack Your Soulmate, involving excessive amounts of blood and gore. And according to gaming expert and psychologist Douglas Gentile, the industry considers addictiveness a game's main indicator of success. But as I say, we continue to have news reports about violent eruptions and murders, shootings, and lots of hand-wringing and speculation as to what caused something like the Norwegian mass murderer Anders Breivik's rampage that killed 99 people in July of 2010. Police reports indicated that he was a computer game abuser, having played World of Warcraft for a total of 500 hours over a period of 3 months. According to U.S. Lieutenant Colonel and Professor of Military Science David Grossman, operant conditioning is a technique widely used in military training to teach soldiers to kill with impunity. What is initiated in these games is the reward aspect of points received for brutal action in video games. That's what is the basis of this training. In the military, these techniques are reluctantly employed as a trade-off for national security reasons, but to indiscriminately reward children for repeatedly blowing off the heads of their virtual playmates is to encourage dangerous and dysfunctional play. I should point out that David Grossman is also a psychologist. In the past, the children who beat up their friends and classmates were published. Today, not only are we teaching them that such violence can be entertaining, we are rewarding them for with points for being good at it. Pioneering media theorist George Gerbner called the normalization of antisocial criminal behavior resulting from violence in the media the mean world syndrome. Predictable consequences usually result in calls for tougher law and order measures such as more prisons and longer sentences. The hidden curriculum constantly reinforces the notion that boys and men should be brutally violent, girls and women are sex objects, buying and accumulating material things leads to happiness, parents and other authority figures are uncool, and that obsessive compulsive behavior is normal. Oops. There. In his book, The Empire of Illusion, Chris Hedges argues that we are now immersed in a culture that has passively given up the linguistic and intellectual tools to cope with complexity, to separate illusion from reality. And this morning we were talking a bit about wishful thinking and willful blindness. In my view, there's a lot of both when it comes to reluctance to examine or acknowledge the research findings on media violence as a form of entertainment and the harmful effects it has on individuals and on society as a whole. I'm just curious, is there anybody here in the room that has not heard of Chris Hedges before in this cult, Empire of Illusion? Everybody knows all about it. Now, today, terrorists are as likely as not to be citizens radicalized via the internet in any country, including Canada. Prevention is getting harder. Debate on this issue is very current, and it was initiated few minutes, by Bill C-30, introduced in the House of Commons in February of 2012. And although it was vetted by every Attorney General, serving provincially and in the territories, the opposition quickly branded it as a draconian attempt at privacy invasion. Occasionally attempts are made to restrict gratuitously violent media for entertainment purposes from being marketed to children. In 2010, California Senator Leland Yee proposed a ban on violent video games backed by the state chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, other health organizations, and supported by 11 other provinces. Nevertheless, the U.S. Supreme Court ultimately ruled in favor of the software industry. And what this case demonstrates is how the court system has leaned in favor of big business in recent years, protecting political speech, pornography, violent media entertainment under the First Amendment, making no distinctions between these three different areas, which a lot of legal scholars have written about over the years. In other words, in addition, they're not making any distinction between individual freedom of expression, even if you decide that pornography is the same thing as political speech, and or corporate freedom of enterprise. Now, this anomaly tends to be overlooked by social and environmental activists. Differences between news media and entertainment media have been blurred, if not obliterated. And the rise of public relations advocacy campaigns warning against the dangers of government interference in the marketplace has conditioned the public at large to accept a gravitational pull in social codes of conduct involving all forms of media toward the consensus of those in power. And calls for marketing, restrictions on marketing violence to children as harmless entertainment are not new, and over the years have come from the American Psychological Association, American Psychiatric, Canadian and American Pediatric Societies, U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention, Canadian Center for Science in the Public Interest, Center for Policy Alternatives, EduPax, which is based in Quebec, and an organization I've chaired since 1986, Canadians Concerned About Violence in Entertainment. As American psychologist Craig Anderson points out, after 40 years of research, one would think that the debate about harmful effects would be over. Many criticisms in the new debate are recycled myths from earlier objections to restrictions that have repeatedly been debunked on theoretical and empirical grounds. Valid weaknesses have been identified and often corrected by media violence researchers themselves. On the whole, it is impossible to discuss media violence without taking into account some of the deeper and broader manifestations of dominant media interests in every aspect of social, political, economic, and cultural life. Throughout the literature on mass media, dating back over half a century, there is a recurring theme of indignant campaigns and suppressions, of shading of certain messages to the exclusion of others, and selection of content and an agenda which is highly functional for established power. I have examples in the paper that's been distributed earlier. We now see the same tactics used to discredit scientists on global warming, in attacks on the International Panel on Climate Change reports. Over the years, many Americans have pointed out that in drafting the First Amendment, Thomas Jefferson emphasized that their legal system must be responsive to changing historical conditions. In his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, published in 1986, Neil Postman called for a ban on commercials for products such as tobacco, hazardous to public health. Such bans are also needed, in my view, on toxic popular culture products. In 1996, the cultural environment movement was launched at Webster University in St. Louis by George Gertner. The issue of media violence was defined as the first phase of a major cultural debate about life in the 21st century, and citizens were urged to take lessons from the wider environmental movement. Legislation in Quebec, the UK, Scandinavian countries, France, Switzerland, Italy, Malta, New Zealand, Greece, and other countries banning advertising to children based on research showing harmful effects has yet to be adopted in the rest of Canada, despite several bills introduced at both the federal and provincial level in Ontario in recent years. Calls have also been made and bills introduced to eliminate taxes and funding for audiovisual productions deemed to be contrary to the public interest. In Canada, Bill C-10, introduced by the minority Harper government in 2008, although initially passed in the House of Commons, was ultimately defeated by the Liberal-dominated Senate. The lobbyists got to the appropriate people. I remember having to go make a presentation to the Senate Committee on Banking, Trade and Commerce in support of the legislation. And I think I was one of about 3 people. All the rest were arguing terrible infringement on freedom of expression. In 2011, it was reported in the New York Times that wasteful government spending in both Canada and the U.S. involves generous tax breaks for video game producers, regardless of content, making the industry one of the most highly subsidized on the continent. In Ontario, such generous tax subsidies are discreetly earmarked for electronic arts. Community colleges and universities with programs in video game design are among the recipients of this largesse and help to foster, in many cases, and to sustain the problem. All advertising is ultimately condoned and encouraged by government policies and regulations. Allowing businesses to write off their advertising expenditures does not only cost the government tens of billions annually in revenues, but also encourages ever greater commercialism of our culture. Not a healthy outlook for long-term environmental sustainability. The capitalist system, as we have known it for 3 centuries, has outlived its usefulness. A system that promotes poverty, inequality, waste, and destruction to the point of making the planet uninhabitable deserves no free pass from democratic interrogation regardless of its past achievements. And despite endless claims that a great new system is just around the corner thanks to digital technologies, there is little evidence to back them up. Growing concern over, in conclusion, I'm going to say growing concern over how the internet fuels terrorism, cyberbullying, and other excesses antithetical to social health and well-being are just the tip of the iceberg of what lies ahead for elected officials. They cross over party lines and surpass current abilities to deal with them. Older challenges of how to govern our economy are still with us, but now we are being overtaken by the need to decide how we should govern technology. It offers us enormous potential in mobilizing for political action, limiting climate change, maintaining the biosphere, and securing energy needs, but governments and educators must engage these issues in a serious way soon or risk losing entirely the ability to influence outcomes. That's it. Thank you for your attention.